Alrighty, so welcome to this edition of the Boss Academy. Today's topic is how to determine the value and risk of technology in a startup or scale-up. The agenda is relatively short for today. First, I will try to convince you that I'm not just a random weirdo that is using ChatGPT to make a nice presentation. Then we talk a little bit about what is actually technology due diligence, what is it not, when does it typically take place. Because I love principles and I explain later what the principles are, we talk afterwards about the 3 principles of a startup TDD. I will use TDD instead of technology due diligence because else I will go nuts. If there is one piece of this talk that you remember, I would hope it will be this piece. And afterwards, we will go a little bit into the questions that you should try to answer when you do a TDD on a startup. Those 10 questions will lead to many, many questions more. But if you can somehow comfortably address these 10 questions, then you have a very good view on both value and risk side of a startup. So a few words about me. My name is Enrico Dolfing, originally from the Netherlands, living in Switzerland for quite a while, made a few stops in between in the US and the UK and Germany, having my own company for too long already. What I typically do is I help larger companies to make better business decisions around technology, and then I actually help them executing the transformation projects that result out of these decisions. In that context, I have been part of quite a few TDDs, both on the buy side as well as the sell side. The sell side is never funny because everybody's asking those questions, right? My background is in computer science and machine learning. On the right you find a few clients of mine. So as a hobby, quite an expensive hobby, I'm actually investing in some startups. I do this directly, but also indirectly as an LP and a VC. For a number of the companies I have invested in, I'm also on the board. And also in that context, I have done quite a few TDDs. So this talk is pretty much a summary of my experiences in both areas, corporate and startup, and also where they intertwine when corporate actually tries to buy a startup. So what is a TDD, or technology due diligence? As stated in the title already, you basically try to look at 2 things. You look at the value of the tech in the company, but also the risks that go along with it. And the word technology here is quite important, because you can have a very valuable company with piss poor technology. You can also have a company with the coolest and best technology in the world and still be a shitty company, right? So this talk is only about looking at the tech piece, but you always have to combine it with the rest of the business, right? So there are even quite a few cases actually where technology has a negative value. Right? When you try to buy a company and you want to bring their platform into your technology domain, and it's a complete mismatch from technology stack, or the technology is complete legacy and migration costs millions, right? Typical old core banking systems built on IBM host and COBOL, right? Then you actually have a negative value for tech during your TDD, and that impacts the sales price. So typically a TDD happens M&A, where you usually look at, hey, how well does it fit to my company? And afterwards, how well does it scale? Right? Because typically you buy something with the idea, I can do it better as the company I'm buying it from, so it needs to get bigger. When you do an IPO, it's typically to check if it holds up to public scrutiny. And there you usually look more security pieces, data protection, everything that is said in the media, is it actually correct, etc. So also a tech DD, totally different scope, totally different focus. When you look at a scale-up or a startup, there is less to do, right? Because the technology state is typically smaller, right? And you also have a completely different focus. So it's all tech DD, but it is a completely different scope. When we look at a startup scale-up, as I said before, I am a fan of expressing things in principles. I do that for a number of things I repeat in my job, if that's project management, if that is building up a strategy, whatever. If you start formulating with your principles, it's easy to build logic on top. And if then your principle is proven wrong, you know you can throw everything away, right? So, and then a principle is pretty much a truth or a proposition that is the foundation of a belief or of a chain of thinking, right? And I strongly believe that the 3 principles we're going through now are true. And based on that, the rest of a TDD actually becomes easier to do. So, first principle, technology is actually worthless by itself. You can have beautiful tech, you can have invested millions and millions in it. When you don't apply the tech to a specific problem, it will have 0 value. The same is true for the risks. If you don't use the tech, if you don't apply it to a certain problem, it also has no risks. Right? If you don't use an atom bomb, there is no risk. Funny enough, there is a value, the threatening value, right? But you always have to look at technology in combination with the problem it tries to solve. So that is why the starting point of every single TDD should be actually getting a thorough understanding about the problem it should solve. Right? And when you look at most pitches in BAS, probably VCI as well, SIGTIC, the CEOs of the companies focus on, this is our product, these are the features, this is what it can do, this is what the competition can't do. And they spend a lot of time on that. But they don't spend a lot of time on actually defining the problem that they want to solve. Yes, there is always a slide about the market, but not about the problem. And to really understand the problem, right, you can basically ask yourself, hey, is this something that is important enough for the people I'm trying to sell it to be solved? Actually, there, a lot of tech startups already fail because they start building tech, the tech is cool, and then they start to finding problems that can be solved with that tech. You will always find problems, right? If not, just get married, you get a few. But you have to really have a problem that is important enough for people to be addressed. And then the group of people or group of companies need to be large enough to actually build a company around it. Right? When I have only 10 people on the whole planet that would be interested in buying my tech, buying the solution to the problem, then they have to be able to pay a very high price, because else you should stop with the startup. Right? And that's really the third point. You need to have a problem that is worth paying for. Right? There are a number of problems that I would like to have solved, but I'm not always willing to pay a lot of money for these problems to be solved. And if I want to put technology and build a company around it, then it should be worth something to the people I'm selling it to. So, first step, TDD, really try to understand the problem the tech should solve. Second principle, technology alone will never solve any problem. Lots of startups, but also lots of media outlets, they say tech will solve this, tech will solve that, tech will solve everything. Well, it doesn't. Right? Every single problem is always solved by a combination of people, process, and tech. So your solution is always a combination of those three. And when you take an existing solution and you add new text to the mix, then you typically also see a change in the people aspect and the process aspect. And you need to understand all of it. Because you can develop tech for a certain piece of a solution, but when it results in more complexity or more manual steps, or the people you need to use the tech need to be more trained, more skilled, then the overall solution might not be better than the existing solution. Right? So you really have to look at all three of them. And then within process, an important piece is hidden, because data is always part of the process. And nowadays, data is pretty much the new currency. It's pretty hard to build something that solves a problem that doesn't need data. And data is becoming a big piece of driving the value of a company, but also driving the risks of a company. Where do you get the data from? Is it legal? Is the data of high quality? How integer is the data? Can I keep the data? Am I allowed to share the data with other companies? Can I sell the data? All these questions have nothing to do with tech, but have a huge impact on the tech TDD. So, second principle, tech alone never solves the problem. Third principle, and I already started talking a little bit about it, but the solution to the problem, including the tech of the startup, right, must be better than the existing solutions. If the overall solution is not better, and better can be defined in many different ways, then don't bother. Right? Then the value of the tech is actually not there, because the overall solution is worse than other solutions. Right? So what can be better? It can be faster. You can achieve higher quality, less manual steps, less pollution, many, many different possibilities. But this should be clear, right? And why should it be clear? Well, if you don't express, I would say, how the problem is solved better, then how do you actually prove this? How do you measure this? Right? You need to know what the goal of the solution or the goal of the tech is. Right? And that is a step that many startups have somehow skipped. Right? And that causes problems afterwards, because then it's also very hard to know what you exactly need to build. Right? If you state it's easier to use, says who? Says you as a founder? Or did you actually look at it with an independent user panel? Or do you actually already have 10,000 paying customers that love the product? Right. So, 3 principles. Technology by itself is worthless. Technology by itself doesn't solve any problem. And the overall solution of the startup, including the technology, should be better than existing solutions. And if you have that picture, right? And you're still happy with what you see, then you can start actually putting an effort in the tech DDD itself. And to make that a little bit easier, I formulated 10 questions where I believe that if you have the answer to all 10 of those, you will have a fair picture of both value and risk side of tech of that specific company. So the first one, does the technology actually works as presented? Fake it till you make it is real in the startup world. And that's okay. I'm actually totally a fan of. But as an investor, you should be aware that it is fake, right? So if it's only a video that was made to fake things and there's nothing else behind it, or it was a proof of concept in a lab environment without real data or without real patients, whatever, you need to understand that. So you need to understand what is the real status of the tech presented by the startup. And what is shown in the pitch is 9 out of 10 times not working and repeatable during the first DD meeting, right? So the second question is then, how do you measure if it works? And that is combined with how do you measure if it solves a problem better, right? So you first need to discuss with the startup, hey, what do you use as KPIs or measurements or values, whatever, to determine if your tech is working? And then you should ask for the data to prove this. Both steps can be a very interesting experience. Let's give a short example, right? Everybody's talking about AI. When you deal with a company that is saying that they use AI or machine learning in solving a problem or part of the problem, there is no way around two measurements. One is recall and the other one is precision. This is a so-called confusion matrix, right? So you have the actual value of something that goes into the AI, right? And then you have an outcome that is produced by the AI. And then you can say, I have a bunch of predictions that are correct and were stated by the AI as correct. The same thing works with ChatGPT, right? When I give in a question, I expect an answer, and I have to validate if the answer was correct or not, right? So I have a bunch of ones that are true positive. Hey, the answer is really correct. I also have a number of classifications, right? Let's say I built a startup predictor where the actual value of the startup is very good, but my classifier says, nah, this is going to be a terrible startup. Right? I also have the other way around. The startup is actually terrible, but my AI says, whoa, this is going to be an amazing startup, right? The false positives. And then you have the true negatives, right? Startup is shitty, and the classifier says, that's correct, it is bad. So recall then is from all the values you put into the AI and that are really positive, how many of them are then actually classified as positive by your AI? Right? So if I have 100 startups and 10 of them are really good, and if I put those 100 startups in my AI, how many of those 10, right, are then really classified as positive? Even when the AI says 20 of those are positive. Right? If those 10 are among them, the recall value is 100%. The precision, though, is not so good then. The precision says, of the ones that are labeled as really good, how many of them are really good? And if I take this example, I gave 20 ones back as good, only 10 of them were really good, so my precision was only 50%. So for a startup predictor, this sucks, right? Because I want to have a very high precision, and if I put 100 startups in, and I would only get 5 out, but those are actually good, then this would be amazing, right? So for a startup predictor, precision is really important. When we talk about a brain tumor, it's different. Because if I take the same sample size, I have 100 MRIs, and on 10 of them, there is a brain tumor visible, and I put this into my AI, then I want to have all 10 back. And if I get 10 on top, I don't really care, because it's basically a help for the doctor. It's basically a second opinion. I just want to make sure that my AI catches every tumor. Right? So depending on the problem, recall or precision is more important. But there is no way around it. If you deal with a startup that is doing something with AI, these are the questions you have to ask. Hey, what is your recall value? What is your precision value? How large is your test set? What kind of data is it? And then, what is more important? What is more important for the problem? Right? Third question. What data do you need to deliver the value you promise? In some exceptional cases, the answer would be nothing. This would be really exceptional. Right? Pretty much any business case around technology involves processing data. So sometimes you collect the data yourself. That's amazing. Right? Or your technology produces the data and you do something with it afterwards. But in many cases, you need actually data from somewhere else. Let's take my startup example again. If you want to build a startup predictor, you actually need a lot of data that describes a startup. Right? At the time it was founded, or at the time they go in for the first round. Right? And then with certain things as industry, team size, experience of the team, male, female, average age of the team, problem they try to solve, etc. You have to codify all that, and then you actually need the result of that startup. So did they increase in value over time? Did they make an exit? Right? So building a classifier on top of that is mega easy, right? And dirt cheap. All the models, all the algorithms, they are freely available on Azure, on Google Cloud, easy peasy. But who has that data in a sufficient quality and sufficient quantity? Not many. BOSS has something, maybe VCI has something, SIGTIC has something, but they all use different data sets, different ways of describing the data. So getting a data set is not so easy. And then the second problem comes, even if you could get that data set, are you paying for it? Or are you stealing it? Right? The amount of startups that are just scraping data from websites or just using public available data sets with an open source license to build up their technology around, to test their tech around. Not optimal, to put it mildly. And then even if they have that data, then the question is, what are you allowed to do with it afterwards? Right? There are a number of medtech companies that are sitting on an absolute gold mine because they have patient data, but they can't do anything with it. Right? There are a lot of banks that are sitting on a gold mine of data. There's nothing they can do with it. Same with health insurances. Right? Audit companies. Right? They have all the financials of all the companies they audit. There's nothing they can do with it. They're not even allowed to sell benchmarks. Right? So, understanding where does the data come from, the quality, who owns it, and what are you allowed to do with it is an essential piece of any tech DD. And then what part of the technology is your IP? So, for a software company, there have never been better times than now. Right? It's the availability of technology for you to use, where large parts of the complexity are abstracted and all the development costs are not carried by yourself. It's crazy. It's just amazing times, right? You put a subscription on Azure and you have the latest AI tech. You can scale whatever you want. You can build the most complicated data lakes. Hey, perfect. The problem is, everything you build is built on IP that you don't own. Which is perfectly fine, but as an investor, you really need to understand what is then the piece that the company actually built and is their IP. And again, since AI is such a hype, I will try to give a short example around AI. Right? Typically, any AI startup, right, at a certain point in time, they will tell you a little bit about prompts, at least when it's Gen AI, right? When it's classical machine learning, not, but let's take Gen AI startup. They talk about prompts, they talk about models, they talk about data, right? And we had a few with Boss as well, right? Hey, we built this whole company around giving certain prompts to ChatGPT. It's fine. You probably can build a company around it, at least temporary. That's until OpenAI actually has to make money, which they currently don't, right? But the tech value is absolutely zero. Right? Because building a few prompts or actually Googling how you do a few prompts and fine-tuning a little bit, hey, anybody can do it, right? So, company A, prompt you own, public model, public data, tech value, none. Just nothing. Right? So, when you start building your own model, there it becomes a little bit more interesting, but, right, building a model is nowadays the most easiest thing in the world. When I started in machine learning, it was not. It was also incredibly expensive. But you have now so many deep learning platforms, public available neural networks, that you only have to feed with data, right? And then after a while, you get a model back. You don't have to own the hardware, right? You run it on the cloud, you pay a few $1,000s for a few days, and then you get your own model back, right? So it's really easy to do. I've done it with a few startups myself. It gives typically a better result if you have the correct data accompanying to it, because it's fine-tuned to specifically your problem. But don't sell it as, wow, we're amazing, right? Because easy. So private prompts, private model, but public data, yeah, low value, right? It's You can build an amazing company around it, absolutely, but the tech value is not much. When you own the data and you use a public model, from an investing point of view, it already becomes more interesting. Right? Models come and go, and what is the best model today is definitely not the best model in 4 weeks. Right? And then everybody is coming up with cool new stuff. Right? So not being tied to a certain model and currently lifting with all the work the big companies are doing is actually a smart strategy. But if you don't then use your own data to leverage that model, you have no value. Right? So if you have data that they don't have, then you create some value. The disadvantage is, of course, the moment you use that data on a public model, they have that data, right? Well, try to read in the end user's agreement of ChatGPT what happens with the documents you upload. I challenge you. In the end, they will use it, but not everybody knows that your documents were used for that. So for your specific problem, you still have a head start to your competition, right? So private prompts, public model, private data can actually have a significant value from a tech point of view. And then you have the last company that do everything themselves. So they build their own model, they have their own data, and basically solve the problem completely themselves. Of course, it runs on cloud infrastructure, but the IP of the solution actually belongs to the company, and that is why you generate there the highest value. Right? At the same point of time, it also takes the longest time to go to market. Right? So from a business point of view, this is not necessarily the right way to go, but we're just talking about the value of tech, and then this is my opinion on that. So the fifth one, how unique is your technology and process? Right? Are you one of 3 companies that is trying to solve the problem in a similar way? Are you a spin-off of ETH and the technology is brand new, not even completely working? Are you doing something that everybody's already doing? Are you just a copycat of something that is working in the US? That is something you need to understand. And there is no right and wrong, right? It's from a business point of view, there are a lot of successful copycats, right? They look what worked in the US, then they entered their own market before the US did, and they were extremely successful. The Sunweb brothers, they made a whole business around it in Germany. Right? But as an investor, you need to understand it, because if others are doing it already, and they are bigger in a different market, then the value of your tech is reduced significantly. Right? The same with process. It's always a combination of the two. And if nobody is doing what that startup is doing from a tech point of view, that's fine. That can be actually a really good thing and make it really a nice investment case. When no other companies are trying to solve the problem, just run. Right? And then this question, it's a little bit of a trick question, right? Because I'm always astonished about some questions that VCs but also angels ask early stage startups. What is your moat, right? As if you're building a fucking castle. When you're an early startup, there is no moat, period. Right? It's when you have tech that comes out of research, but that research is published in scientific journals, there is also no moat. And that's fine. Your moat is you're very focused, you have a driven young team, you're very client-centric, you might have new insights, that is how you defend your uniqueness in the beginning. Over time, you might build up some defense also on the tech side. Patents for whatever they are worth. You can have a head start that you can defend for a while. You can have a research group where there are only 5 specialists in the whole world and 3 of them are actually in your startup. You can have an industry partner that nobody else has. So that there are a few things, but in general, right, the uniqueness of a startup early stage, it's just not protected, it's just what it is, and you have to think a little bit about how you go on with that later. If there is no protection whatsoever, which is fine, right? You just have to be aware that the value of the technology is what it would cost to develop the same thing in the country with the cheapest labor. Right? If I see a really, really cool tech and I understand how it works and there is no patent and then there is not like a huge expert skill behind it needed, then I can outsource it to Eastern Europe, I can outsource it to India, and then I can actually just pay that amount and poof, that is the value. What you hear a lot with startups that they say, yeah, but we spent 2 years building this with 5 people, it's worth 2 million. Yeah, but you made every single beginner mistake that you can do, and your architecture sucks balls. So if you have a pro team actually outsourcing it to a cheap country, it's done for 150 and not for 1.5 million, right? So the amount of time worked on tech says nothing about the value. And this is an honest conversation that you have to have with your startups. What security measures are implemented? So maybe I'm a little bit paranoid because I mainly work in the financial industry and healthcare and professional services. But if you work with patient data, client data, you have to have measures in place to protect it. Partly because regulation forces you to, partly because you want to keep your clients, right? Being in a newspaper with a data breach is death for any startup, right? Being stopped by FINMA is death for any company, right? Probability is low with FINMA, I agree, but it can happen. So you have to ask the question, what security measures are implemented on your infrastructure, on your application, on your data. I do not expect from all my startups like that perfect situation, right? But there should be an awareness for these topics. If there is no awareness or not a single consideration and not a single measure in place, then run. Not because of the value, but the risk you have is just too big. And you can't bake that quickly into a new team. When they don't think about these kind of things, then just don't. Then, how operable is your solution? So, operations, that's stuff that nobody likes. The nitty and gritty to actually keep things running. If you have a very early startup, it's very hard to have a meaningful conversation about operations because typically there is not a lot of operations. But if you go to seed or Series A, you actually have operations. And you need to understand how the solution works at one hand from the client perspective, what do they have to do, manual steps, the amount of clicking, etc. But also from the company side, right? What do you have to do at the back end? What is the cost of the infrastructure? Which licenses do you have to pay? What are the skills you need to do something? Is currently everything depending on one person or two persons? Did you outsource part of your operations, right? You need to understand that because that is your risk part. Operations has no value on the tech side. It has, of course, value on the company side. On the tech side, it doesn't. But badly run operations or operations with lots of manual efforts is quite big on the risk side. Then how scalable is your solution? The easiest question to ask is, can you support it if your user base or your clients multiply by 10 or 100? What would then happen? What would you need to do? What do you need to do on the infrastructure side? What do you need to do on the database side? What do you need to do on the team side? Does your architecture actually supports this? Yeah. The persons you need, do they scale linearly with the amount of users? Or flattens it out? Or worse, do you actually need exponential amount of people or cost on the infrastructure side? Right? Those things you really need to understand because it's totally understandable. When you're a startup and you build a solution, you don't build for scale. You actually build a proof of concept. And every software engineer you talk to that starts with a fresh project says, I'm going to build a proof of concept, I'm going to learn, and I'm going to throw it away, start from scratch and do it correctly. Well, that second part never happens. Right? So everybody uses the proof of concept to actually build the product on. So a lot of things need to be figured out afterwards. And scaling is one of them, security is one of them. Right? So very important question, and then there is no right or wrong answer, but the discussion you'll have with your startup around this will actually show a lot about both value and risk if the startup actually grows. If you have a potential exit or a merger, this is pretty much the most important question to address. And then the last one is how maintainable is your solution. There we talk about code quality. Right? You have one brilliant CTO that coded everything, then two people tag along, right? And suddenly the CTO goes, is it still maintainable? How complex is it? Right? How easy is it to onboard other people to the solution? Test automation. Right? Everybody talks about agile and all those stupid Scrum meetings and nobody's working anymore. But nobody wants to talk about the hard work on the back end, which is actually making sure that for each iteration you get a full end-to-end test of everything you have built, plus the new stuff you have built, because you have to do that every week. So if all testing is manual, you have two problems. One, quality sucks balls. Two, you'll never ever able to scale. It's just not going to work. Right? Again, if you find a startup that has none of this, it's okay. You just know this is still something that needs to be done. It reduces the value and increases the risk. Right? So, then we're already at number 10. Again, all these questions will lead to many other questions, but they start facilitating, I think, a very good discussion with a startup. They will shape your understanding on both the value and the risk side. And if you're not in M&A, I think this is good enough for a startup meeting. Questions? Yeah.
I have one question regarding your 6, we touched on the amount of time spent and when it counts and when it doesn't. Just would like to know when is the moment that the amount of time counts, when is the time where it doesn't count. Because if you have an example of outsourcing, definitely makes sense if you get that on cost.
So it's my opinion, so don't take it for gold, but in my opinion, time never counts, ever, ever, ever. Because time spent on building something never defines value at all. You can have the most amazing coder that creates a program in 10 days. Another does exactly the same in 100 days. It is exactly the same value. Right? So using time spent on your startup as a criteria for valuation makes zero sense at all. Because that what creates value is what you have done with that time. Right? Time is an input, it's not an output, and definitely not an outcome. John?
Another question. I mean, startup investing means a small amount of money, 50K, 100K. How much effort do you put into answering all these questions? For example, you just ask, is your solution scalable? They say yes, and you walk on, or you do more?
So, consultant, the correct answer, it depends. No. So, as you are well aware as an angel investor, you typically don't invest one time in a startup. So if you start with the first 25K, soon they need more money, and soon afterwards they need even more money. So typically in my head, I make a commitment for 3 investments. That's my max. So I do the first, if I see traction, I do the second, and if I then see the value going up, I do the third as well. So then I already talk about different amounts, and then I might do a TDD up front based on how important the technology is for the company. So let's, for example, when I did Babylot, I actually spent quite some time on the tech side because it's the only thing that has value in that company, the technology and the patents. Right? When we look at Allow, technology is irrelevant. It's all about the process, so it makes no sense to do a TDD. So the more the startup says everything is based on the tech, the more I think it is worthwhile doing a TDD. The higher the valuation of the company, the more it's worth to do a TDD. And you don't always have to do it yourself, right? There are people who are doing this all the time. You can pool a little bit of money with a number of investors and say, hey, before we do this, we actually want to make sure that the tech is what it is promised. So the more important the tech is for your investment, the more I would tend to actually do this work. For example, last case there in Bos was DeFi space. There are a lot of people spend a lot of time on checking if the tech really worked because it's the only thing that is there. There is no company, there is just tech. And everything is based on the assumption that the tech works and the tech scales. Then you want to put some effort in. Any more questions? If not, I'll be there. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn.